Our epistle reading this morning is from Colossians, the 3rd chapter, verses 12 through 15. As God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another, and if anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other, just as the Lord has forgiven you. So you must also forgive. Above all, clothe yourself with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in the one body. And be thankful. This is the word of the Lord.
It's from John's Gospel, chapter 13. I'll be reading verses 31 to 35. When Judas Iscariot had gone out, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little while longer. You will look for me. And as I said to the Jews, so I now say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Would you pray with me? O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, who are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Fourscore-and-7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So began Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address. It's etched on a marble wall just to the left of Lincoln's magnificent statue at that memorial in Washington, D.C. Lincoln gave the short speech on November 19th, 1863, at the dedication of the cemetery at Gettysburg, where 7,000 people died earlier that year. In addition, there were 23,000 Union and 28,000 Confederate casualties. On my last trip to Washington, D.C., I remember staring out from that memorial through the colossal columns of what really is a modern-day Parthenon, remembering that Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech was delivered from that very spot in 1863. And as a nation, we honor his birthday tomorrow. Well, his birthday was actually January 15th of 1929, and we honor it tomorrow. And Chris and I, as anybody would, staring out from that monument, we looked at the Washington Monument, and way up the hill, the United States Capitol building, and unseen through the trees, but most assuredly there, the White House. The walk from the Lincoln Memorial to the Washington Monument is about a half a mile, and just on the other side of that Washington Monument, the Smithsonian Museum complex begins. A grand group of buildings celebrating some of humankind's greatest achievements in the arts and the sciences and the humanities. Now, all of the museums are free. Anyone can enter regardless of their stature and learn. Chris and I worked our way up to the Capitol building, and as we gazed out from the National Mall, I kind of became intoxicated by the idea of Washington, D.C. It's the center of world power, culmination of a grand experiment in self-government. All of those buildings, if I just closed my eyes and spun around and opened them and said, presto, I could have been in the ancient days of Rome or Greece. But as the days went by, began to feel a sense of sorrow hanging over the city, enveloping it as if the city itself were draped with the stars and the stripes. I felt it first at the Vietnam War Memorial. 58,200 names. Remembering my own time in the Air Force as an intelligence officer during the Vietnam War era, my time spent in South Korea rather than Vietnam. 35th Tactical Fighter Squadron from our base was deployed to Thailand at the time, but I was not sent. And at the wall, I watched as an elderly man pressed his hand up against the wall, pressing against it with his elderly fingers against what I assume was the name of a man or a woman there, pressing and praying as if somehow it was going to bring life out of that stone. And I kept finding myself near or in tears after reminder came of the loss of human life. Standing first at Lincoln's feet, then at the World War II Memorial, and at the Korean War Memorial. The unspeakable capacity for human cruelty displayed and brought to life at the Holocaust Museum. Sitting in a chair at Ford's Theater beneath Lincoln's balcony as the narrator intoned the last conscious moments of our president. Everywhere you go, there is a statue, there's a memorial. There's a grand view across the Potomac River from the southern side of the Lincoln Memorial. High up on the hill sits a beautiful yellowish-orange columnar house. It belonged to the Custis family, a family into which Robert E. Lee married. He lived at that home for over 30 years. His wife, Mariana Custis, loved to tend the flower garden. And it's still there. If you kind of lean out far enough from the garden walkway, you can just see the tops of the heads of people who are standing at John F. Kennedy's grave. There are some 400,000 gravestones on the rolling hills beneath Lee's home, Arlington Cemetery. Grief thick like a cloud of sons and daughters, wives and husbands, brothers and sisters, fathers and mothers, grandmas and grandpas. And high on that hill, overlooking D.C., I pictured Jesus standing, lamenting as he had over Jerusalem, lamenting that our grand experiment in freedom has resulted in far too many of us grasping for power, substituting egocentricity for godly humility. Jesus lamenting the fruit of a proclamation based on human rights for the individual citizen and the stranger within our midst that has far too often yielded self-absorption and individualism passionate over personal pursuits, preferences, and comforts. Jesus lamenting over a city and a nation divided in 1863, and now 156 years later in 2019. I envision Jesus' ascension from that home of Robert E. Lee, and higher from that divine perspective, the Potomac River shrinks into a very thin, silvery line, hardly discernible enough to have been the dividing point between North and South, setting family against family. In fact, from that divine perspective, I imagine that our sinfulness all looks pretty much the same. There's some arrogance, tribalism, leftism, rightism, sexism, consumerism, racism, nationalism, ageism, individualism, and any other ism. They are all idolatries. They are all failures in love. Both Jesus and the Apostle Paul have some love lessons for us today. Chapter 13 of John's Gospel, it begins that lengthy account of the telling of the Last Supper. It runs from chapter 13 to chapter 17. John told us at the beginning of chapter 13 that Jesus knew that his hour had come, but that he loved us till the end. The words and action in the text comprise a small portion of that farewell address to the disciples, which means it was a farewell address to each and every one of us. And because it is a farewell address, it is embedded in grief. Throughout the narrative, Jesus is telling us, teaching us the more excellent way, the way of love. At the beginning of chapter 13, verses which I did not read, is where Jesus washed the disciples' feet. And in washing the disciples' feet, Jesus teaches us that love involves servanthood and humility. I fear that we, on the other hand, have so used and over-abused the word love, and preachers are among the worst, that as a community, we don't really have a good clue what it means anymore. Among Beaver Cleaver in the 50s, Make Love Not War in the 60s, Free Love and Friends in the 90s, and reality TV in the new millennium, the word love is awash in confusion. I think far too often we've come to believe that love is cheap and that it's easy. And it is anything but. As Christians, we must remember that it was the cost of love that was the earthly life of Jesus. It's cheap. It's blasphemy. In our teaching from John today, Jesus says that love is a new commandment. Because Jesus knew that given half a chance, we humans will clutch at law rather than love. The Jews did it, and we do it. It's easier. We've lost sight of the fact that the wonderful Constitution that governs us here in America gives us the freedom to pursue Jesus' higher ethic of love. Have you any idea how rare that is in human history? Love is a new commandment because love transcends law, Torah. Love rises higher. It explores new planes. Love takes all of God's concerns for justice and mercy and compassion, fairness and faith, kindness, forgiveness, reconciliation. It takes all of those things into itself and blesses them and calls the heart of each believer to take personal responsibility and accountability for one's own moral behavior and thought. But think about it. I mean, in a lot of ways, isn't it easier to take our concerns to court? I don't care if it's a formal court of law, a court of the church, the council of friends, or if you're my age, dear Abby. Isn't it easier for somebody else, that third party out there, to weigh the scales and say who is right and who is wrong, nice and neat and tidy? Hate crimes legislation has been passed. It's a good thing. It prescribes a punishment for, but it does not solve hate. Evidence the shootings late last year in the synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, followed fairly shortly thereafter by more shootings in Thousand Oaks, California. Martin Luther King, in his 1963 speech, Strength to Love, said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." But the law of love is a good bit slower than the law of the land. God is into soul crafting and faith formation as together we, you and I, seek what is good and right and acceptable. It takes time. It's not easy. And it requires talking with each other about things that matter. Reinhold Niebuhr, famous theologian in the 20th century, called love the impossible possibility. Impossible because we're not God. Possible because God has given us Jesus Christ, who has shown us the way. In him, God's love is glorified. In him, we all participate in the holy. Not surprisingly, biblical love starts at the beginning. God created everything. Created everything out of love. He created us male and female, fashioned in God's likeness, fashioned in God's character. imbued with God's values. All that good stuff is where we started. But we went wrong. And the good got marred. Love, the gift of love, which the choir opened with as a prelude this morning. Talk about the Spirit moving through things. Just that 1 Corinthians 13 would have been the anthem for this morning, God's Spirit. Paul said in those words that we look through this glass darkly. So we look through that marredness. It's kind of, for anybody who's ever put a welding hood on, it takes a pretty bright light to see through that. It's kind of like what we're looking through at times. We see the form as it drifts by, but we can't really make it out. Sometimes we see through that glass really differently. But the good news is that God in that resurrected Jesus Christ wants to reawaken that original Imago Dei, which was breathed into each and every one of us in our birth. It's that image of God within you and within me. That image is the foundation stone of healthy self-love and self-respect. It's God made you and me. I don't care how pretty you are, how smart you are, or how challenged you are, how rich you are, or how poor you are, how white, black, red, or brown you are. God made you. You are God's child, and God loves you. Don't let anyone ever abuse you and tell you differently. And it is out of that kind of understanding of yourself as a child of God, loved and cherished, that we offer back our thanks and our love to God in worship. And we act out that response out in the world by taking God's love and caring for other people out in the world and community. Now, make no mistake. This kind of love is costly. It puts others' interests ahead of our own. May even be persecuted for loving in Jesus' name. But Jesus tells us a little bit later in that Last Supper to be of good cheer because he has overcome the world. We go out into the world knowing that we have the power of Christ to endure. And I make no mistake. We are going to make mistakes along love's highway. Love's a bit like life in that way, a little bit like history. It moves forward in a wavy line, but not a circle. We do not come back time and again, second, third, fourth, fifth take on the script. God's plan for living love out in the world is a bit more like on-the-job training. But the good news is we have the presence of the Holy Spirit walking alongside us to guide us. We have the Word of God is given to us through the Holy Scriptures. We have our leader's body, the church, each other, to help us. There are highs and lows along love's road. I'm going to share what will be, I'm sure, a trite saying with you, but in my experience, both from my work in the parish and from many years working as a chaplain at MD Anderson, what I'm about to tell you is completely true. I have never spoken to a person who, near the end of his or her life, has said to me, I wish I would have spent more time at the office. The wish has generally been for deeper relationships, frankly, more playtime with loved ones. Power and possessions, while not unimportant, are not what life is about, folks. Love is. And the opportunities for loving come wrapped up in the grist of ordinary life and experiences. Don't get caught at the end of yours with the lament on your lips, I wish I would have. I wish I would have spent more time talking with God in prayer. I wish I would have told my spouse, my wife, that I loved her more often, not only with my words, but in my deeds. I wish I would have said I'm sorry to the kids. I wish I had gone to visit that friend in the hospital, and I wish I had taken the time to smile at that man in the wheelchair. gone once more to the nursing home, said forgive me after a fight, listened to a parent, come home at curfew, befriended the new kid on the block, dare I say listened to a Democrat or listened to a Republican. Friends, love is not easy. Now, on a communion Sunday, we break bread and we drink the cup, and Jesus fills the holes in our lives with life and love, and it lasts for a while. But we leak. So we come back to worship, and we return to the table all so that we can start anew, try again. I was a junior in high school in 1965 when Jackie DeShannon released Burt Bacharach and Hal David's song, which began with these lyrics. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. It's the only thing that there's just too little of. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. No, not just for some, but for everyone. Those were very troubled days here and in the world in the 1960s, and I had hoped we would not revisit them, but we have. And so I'm reminded of the invitation that Jesus gave us at the beginning of today's lesson, to heed a commandment that each and every one of us let love be the center of our heart's desire, and to leave the sanctuary today renewed to live that love out in this world, in all that we do and say and think. And we can do that with courage because the battle has been won. Can you catch the scent of it? In Matthew 25, Jesus said, whenever you do it unto the least of these, feed, clothe, drink. In this congregation, as I look at your Super Bowl of caring and your Habitat for Humanity, you are finding those ways to extend that love and that grace into the community, to the least of these. And Paul said, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another. Forgive one another. And above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. What's love got to do with it? It's everything.